In 53 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar is close to bringing all of Gaul under his control. His plan is to amass enough wealth and fame from this conquest to return to Rome a hero who can take full power.
The spoils of war, the loot and the plunder that could be gained from conquest were a major motivator for generals and soldiers alike. Therefore, the campaign in Gaul was motivated by a desire to be able to repay his debts and refill his coffers so that he could become a supreme politician in Rome.
Caesar has successfully forced the major tribes of Gaul to submit to Rome as allies. But the situation is about to change. One of the most powerful and respected Gallic tribes, the Carnutes, decides to fight back. The Carnutes are led by a man called Cotuatus, who organizes a meeting of the Gaul chiefs. He wants to organize a large-scale rebellion against Caesar. The insurgents don't yet have the numbers needed to fight Caesar, but they represent powerful tribes. Vercingetorix, the leader of the Arverni tribe, is here too. The former protege of Caesar chooses the side of the insurrection. This is his opportunity to fulfill his dream and become leader of all Gaul. But the agreement needs the blessing of another important group of Gauls. Every year, powerful and mystic people from across Gaul gather at a meeting. These are the Druids. Caesar considered the Druids, alongside the nobility, as the most important social groups of Gaul. The Druids were the religious leaders of Gaul and had considerable power and influence. The Gauls considered them wise, skilled in medicine, philosophy, and justice. Archaeologists think the Druids built a sacred enclosure with spaces for ceremonies. Statues or divine representations were formally forbidden. The Druids honored their gods with animal sacrifices. Caesar wrote that the Druids practiced human sacrifice too, but there's little proof to support the idea. The Carnute tribe leader, Cotuatus, likely sealed the new rebellion agreement with a religious ceremony, asking the Druids to give it their sacred blessing. A widespread uprising of the Gauls is born.
Vercingetorix, in a way, exploited this unhappiness. He saw it and then used it to launch his own career.
Vercingetorix will spend the next months convincing as many Gauls as possible to join. But why does he choose this moment to officially join the fight? Clues lie on the other side of the Alps. Historians think that this was a moment when Caesar was particularly vulnerable. He spends his winters in Ravenna, in the north of Italy. He is preoccupied with grave political concerns. In 53 BC, his alliance, the Triumvirate, shatters with the death of Crassus. Caesar knows that the third man, Pompey, will take advantage of the situation to seize full power.
Suddenly it became a question: would Pompey and Caesar continue to work together? Pompey grew jealous in some ways of what Caesar was achieving. Pompey was used to being regarded as the first man in Rome.
Caesar had to become concerned in an ever greater way that his enemies in Rome would turn their entire attention towards him.
And news from Gaul is about to add to his problems. The uprising has begun, and the Gauls have massacred Roman traitors. The rebels are sending a clear message. no Roman, military or civilian, is safe in Gaul. The rebel tribes are gearing up for war. Their reputation for fighting and the quality of their weapons was well respected in Rome. But why? Guillaume Reich is an archaeologist who investigates the military equipment of the Gauls. He wants to find out what technology the Gauls used to create their deadly weapons.
Okay, so the spear. It's the most widespread weapon in Gallic antiquity. But it should be noted that part of the warrior population also had a sword with an all-metal sheath, which is a little marvel in terms of forging. So this sword is entirely made of iron, it's straight, with two parallel cutting edges, with a point that is not very pronounced, and it's held inside a scabbard. This full metal scabbard is almost a work of art. We find that millimeter precision was needed to assemble the different components. It's a feat of forging, and it's a Gallic invention.
But this full metal jacket of a scabbard isn't the only military innovation by the Gauls.
We have, for example, this body protection called chainmail, invented by the Gauls in the 4th century BC. It was made up of thousands of small iron rings. In total, it weighs about 25 pounds. This armor was kept in use until very recently. It's surprising, but during the First World War, chainmail was still used. This is a Gallic invention, but it's not the only one on this table. We have, for example, this helmet with cheek covers called paragnatids, and a neck cover which has been designed specifically to protect from blows that come from above. It's another Gallic invention, this helmet design, which was taken up by the Romans.
Guillaume's investigations expose that the Gauls and their innovative weapons were a formidable match for Caesar's Roman army. The Gauls have something else going for them: superior numbers. Vercingetorix is gaining increasing support.
He gradually constructed, over the next months, an army that outnumbered the Romans by a factor of perhaps 4 or 5 to 1.
But what will happen when the Arverni leader finally clashes with his former mentor? Julius Caesar knows he's facing a formidable opponent.
Vercingetorix threatened everything Caesar had achieved in Gaul. He'd been fighting for 6 years, and suddenly there was a rebellion, an uprising that could put everything he'd achieved at risk.
Caesar must have feared that this uniting of Gallic tribes under Vercingetorix could be just the beginning of a more unified, strategic, and organized foe.
Caesar is separated from his main forces, so he needs to outwit Vercingetorix. He surprises the Gauls by crossing the Cevennes mountain range and heading for the Arverni capital of Gergovia. Vercingetorix is in a tribal area called Bituri and reacts as Caesar predicts. He reroutes his army to defend his homeland. While his generals occupy Vercingetorix's troops, Caesar travels to join the Roman legions in the north.
One of the stories told about Caesar was that to get to a camp of his in Germany, he disguised himself as a Gaul. This is something he never actually recorded in his own commentaries. Perhaps Caesar thought it was undignified to mention this, or perhaps it was just a legend. But the story speaks to the extraordinary lengths Caesar went to. Caesar pushed himself harder in the Gallic War than he ever had in his life before, and was determined to do anything, almost, to win.
The well-maintained roads of Gaul allow the Romans to march quickly. Historians estimate that Caesar's troops advance at a rate of almost 20 miles per day. A vast network of roads has spanned Gaul for centuries. The first trade route of Gaul starts in Marseille and goes up the Rhone and Saône valleys to join the Seine River. Roads lead to the center of Gaul, the Atlantic coast, present-day Belgium, and the English Channel. The second main trade road leaves Narbonne and follows the Aude Valley to reach the Atlantic Ocean. These ancient roads are the origin of the famous Roman roads of France that remain major roads even today. At the end of 53 BC, Caesar uses this sophisticated network to return to his isolated legions. Very quickly, the balance of power reverses in favor of Caesar. Faced with the rapidly advancing Romans, the Gauls need a new tactic.
Vercingetorix proposes to the Gauls that they do not fight the Romans in a pitched battle, but that they basically embrace a form of guerrilla strategy.
They were nervous about taking the Roman legionaries on in a direct conflict. So Vercingetorix decided on a scorched earth strategy. The Roman army was large, it required food. They didn't have lots of supplies, they needed to live off the land. So Vercingetorix's strategy was to burn the countryside around Caesar, to remove all of the grain that had been stored there, even to destroy whole towns, to destroy farms.
It's a controversial tactic, but the leader of the Arverni tribe manages to persuade his followers of its value. It's a sign that he's gaining power and on his way to becoming commander-in-chief of the rebels. In a single day, more than 20 towns go up in smoke. But not everyone agrees to destroy their homes. Vercingetorix faces strong pushback from the Bituri and their city at Avaricum. Its people have become wealthy through the tin trade. Their buildings are typical of the Gauls, large and rectangular or square, comfortable and well insulated thanks to their thick walls and thatched roofs. The Gauls use a loom to make thick woolen fabrics for clothing. Their clothing is brightly colored and decorated with checked, striped, or even tartan patterns. Even with the Romans advancing, the chiefs refuse to destroy their city. They believe their town is well protected by marshes and waterways that surround it. Vercingetorix decides to leave the city standing, perhaps hoping that any conflict will wear down Roman troops. Caesar understands the strategic value of Avaricum's location. The capital of the Bituri tribe is on a major communication route between Vercingetorix and the rebel allies. Caesar and his legionnaires arrive at Avaricum in April 52 BC. They find a well-defended city surrounded by imposing fortifications. But what did the Gauls' defenses look like? Clues lie at the lost ruins of the ancient capital of the Aedui tribe, Bibracte. Archaeologist Sophie Krauss is investigating Gallic engineering to understand the challenge that Caesar faced.
We're at the end of the Bibracte site. We're on the largest Gallic site in France, and it's one of the most beautiful natural sites in Europe. A very beautiful setting for an archaeological excavation. It's an extraordinary place. Extraordinary.
Sophie's excavations at Bibracte are unearthing a remarkable defensive structure known as a Murus Gallicus.
Alors ce qu'on voit ici,
Okay, so what we can see here are the traces that remain of this rampart.
des traces qui sont plus
Traces that are mostly quite well preserved.
tout à fait devant.
In front of the stones, these big stones are the remains of the outer face of the rampart.
C'est-à-dire ce que les gens voyaient quand
So
ils étaient devant.
this is what people saw when they were in front of the rampart.
On trouve le cœur
Behind these stones is the heart of the Murus Gallicus.
ici,
So it's a whole area that is yellow there.
entrecroisé.
It's formed of wooden beams pinned with nails at the intersections with solid earth packed inside.
Très dur.
It's a very hard and very strong core.
L'arrière de ce cœur,
And then at the back of this, there is a ramp which allowed the Gauls, those who guarded the rampart, to climb to the top.
de monter au sommet.
The team's discoveries reveal more than just the clever engineering of the Gauls. Now this lost city is exposing the true scale of the challenge facing Caesar. Engineers have reconstructed the defensive structure, revealing what Caesar faced when he attacked the Gauls. The Murus Gallicus wall here was more than 4 miles long and up to 13 feet tall.
Alors les pierres que l'on voit
So the
ici,
stones here are the stones of the original Murus Gallicus at the door of the fort, which has been reassembled and reconstructed.
donc ce sont des pierres sèches,
They are dry stone, there is no mortar between these stones,
et on voit surtout
but most importantly, there are wooden beams that actually pierce the wall.
transpercent en fait le mur et qui
They serve as reinforcement.
tiennent
They support the heart of the rampart, and they protrude outwards for an aesthetic effect, which is typical of a Murus Gallicus.
du Murus Gallicus. Jules Caesar
Julius Caesar described the Murus Gallicus when he started the siege of Avaricum. He talks about the stones, the alternating beams, and he said that the whole thing is not unpleasant to the eye. So he found it very pretty.
très joli.
What will happen when Julius Caesar comes up against defenses like this at the Gaul stronghold of Avaricum? The Roman general will need to deploy the full force of military engineering to overcome the giant walls of the city.
The Romans were absolute masters in the art of siege warfare. There was no wall that the Romans were uninterested in battering down.
Caesar orders 2 60-feet-high siege ramps built, each of which can support the weight of a mobile assault tower. Roman engineers build the ramps over the Gallic fortifications to reach the top of the walls. But the Gauls in Avaricum fight back and build new high fortifications to overlook the Romans. Meanwhile, little more than 10 miles away, Vercingetorix sets up camp. In an attempt to save Avaricum, he decides to exfiltrate all the warriors from the city, asking them to flee through the swamps. But the strategy involves abandoning women and children within Avaricum. And the Gaul women have other ideas. In noble Gaul society, women were often in sole charge of the farms and had financial autonomy. Vercingetorix would have grown up surrounded by leading women. With the fighting mostly undertaken by men, Gaul women were active in all other trades. They work in the fields and take on other responsibilities. They are free to choose their husbands and to divorce them, remaining owners of their own property. In Avaricum, the women prevent the soldiers from leaving and urge them to stay and fight. But when Caesar's troops succeed in storming the city, it's a bloodbath. It was customary amongst both Romans and Gauls to massacre the survivors of a siege. It was the best way to take revenge while terrorizing the enemy.
In the aftermath of the siege of Avaricum, there was indiscriminate slaughter. Caesar tells us that 40,000 people were killed, including women and children.
It's a big win for the Romans.
the supplies there and the access to provisions and such that Avaricum provided basically gave Caesar, another lifeline.
The few survivors join Vercingetorix's forces. He uses the horror of the slaughter to galvanize support and rally his troops. He knows that the best route to defeating Caesar is to unite Gaul. Vercingetorix quickly obtains the support of many tribes. The Nitiobrogues and the Atrebates of modern-day Belgium are allied to Rome, but now join the rebels. But Vercingetorix knows he needs the support of the powerful Aedui and their capital at Bibracte. If he can persuade them to abandon their allegiance to Caesar, it will be a disaster for the Roman general. Caesar is well aware of the danger that Vercingetorix poses if he succeeds in uniting the Gauls. So he chooses to attack Vercingetorix's home city, Gergovia.
Gergovia was the capital of the Arverni, the tribe that Vercingetorix belonged to. And Caesar hoped that by winning a great victory there, he would be able to prevent more Gauls from defecting to the other side.
But the Roman general underestimates the challenge. This is the site of Gergovia today. Vercingetorix beats Caesar here and occupies the high ground. After days of skirmishes, a group of centurions make it to an area of the fortifications that Gaul warriors have left undefended. But Caesar writes that Gaul women raise the alarm, alerting the warriors, who race back and drive off the Romans. The battle at Gergovia ends in a resounding defeat for Caesar. The Roman general claims to have lost 700 soldiers and 46 centurions, but historians today think the figure was likely much higher.
It was a real defeat for Caesar. It was a reversal for him. This was a vindication for Vercingetorix.
After Gergovia, Caesar was headed in a southern direction, and he himself says that Vercingetorix tried to fire up his own men by suggesting that Caesar and the Romans were fleeing Gaul. And I suspect that Caesar has Vercingetorix make that statement to discredit it, right? When it was actually a very, very real possibility.
And Julius Caesar's problems are about to get much worse. His dominance has relied on division amongst the tribes. Now Vercingetorix uses his military success to grow his coalition and persuades leaders from the influential Aedui tribe to break their allegiance with Rome.
They converted from allies of Rome to resistors of Rome. Vercingetorix, in essence, was successful in persuading them that their support of Rome was ultimately not in the long-term interest of themselves as leaders of their tribes or of their people.
We know of half a dozen Gallic tribes that were clients, subjects almost to the Aedui. And now with the Aedui switching sides, those other tribes were expected to switch sides too. So you do very much get a snowball effect of sorts.
Almost all of Gaul had joined the uprising. Caesar had very few allies left.
When the Gauls united, they vastly outnumbered Caesar's army.
Vercingetorix spots his chance to take leadership of the Gauls. When he is called to a council meeting at Bibracte, the capital of their new Aedui allies, it's his chance to ensure the Aedui can't back out and resume ties with Caesar. And it's a success for the ambitious Gaul. the council gives Vercingetorix supreme command of the united forces of Gaul.
Nous allons reprendre notre liberté. Tous ensemble!
The fact that the Gauls came to unite under Vercingetorix is an index of just how significantly terrified they were that the Romans were going to impose Roman rule over the entire area.
He has achieved something that Caesar has always feared: a Gaul united in opposition against the Romans.
If we imagine the landscape that Julius Caesar confronted up until that point, he had been remarkably successful in fragmenting the interests of the Gauls, in getting local leaders to conceive of their interests as not united with other Gauls. The grand achievement of Vercingetorix was his ability to persuade people that resistance to the Romans was not simply possible but necessary. He therefore gradually constructed, over the next months, an army that outnumbered the Romans by a factor of perhaps 4 or 5 to 1.
You know, it's almost a bit like the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars. You just have all these different peoples coming together, trying to take on the evil empire.
But what will happen when the two sides meet in the final showdown? Vercingetorix decides to establish a stronghold at a fortified city called Alesia. It's isolated on a high plateau surrounded by hills, a layout that proved effective at Gergovia.
Alesia was a site where Vercingetorix tactics of drawing Caesar out, denying him resources, and Caesar's siege works came together in a spectacular manner.
When Caesar arrives, he orders his legions to build a vast network of ramparts and moats to lay siege to the city. The work is colossal. Roman engineers build walls almost 10 miles long, dotted with watchtowers. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix realizes he'll need outside support. He sends out his cavalry to gather reinforcements. It's a clever move that also reduces the number of people to feed inside his besieged city. Now Caesar has a problem. His legions are vulnerable to outside attack. Caesar's engineers set to work on a second wall to protect their rear. This one needs to be even bigger, almost 14 miles long. Caesar and his forces are now trapped inside a donut-shaped fortification. To protect the walls, Roman engineers build a series of obstacles and traps. Thick fences of sharpened branches, barbed spears to pierce and snag the enemy, and pits with sharp stakes at their base.
While motivated by a very precarious situation of siege and counter-siege, the construction actually provided the Roman military with the comfort of being between two enormous barricades of their own construction.
In Caesar's representation, the siege was not simply an act of waiting it out, but devolved rapidly into tests of strength and will on each side.
Vercingetorix regularly sends forces to attack the builders and delay construction. Inside Alesia, the Gaul leader orders strict rationing of food. But stocks of grain quickly run out. At least Vercingetorix knows that Caesar and the Romans must be facing a similar challenge. But the situation is about to turn in the Gauls' favor. Vercingetorix receives good news. Reinforcements have arrived. The cavalry he sent out have performed miracles. According to Julius Caesar's writing, they return with 250,000 men.
He had finally trapped Julius Caesar in a way that had never been done before. The opportunity was presented to them to obliterate a Roman army, and it would either succeed or it would fail completely.
The next day, tens of thousands of Gaul warriors swarm the west of Caesar's outer fortification, while Vercingetorix leads an attack on the inner rampart. The confrontation lasts until dusk. The Gauls wreak havoc on the Roman ranks. Caesar himself acknowledges that many of his legionnaires abandon the battle. The Roman general is forced to mobilize his backup plan: a German mercenary cavalry who turn the tide of battle in favor of the Romans. Days later, a third battle begins well for Vercingetorix's Gauls. Caesar claims that his side is close to defeat, until he throws himself into battle and rallies his troops.
Caesar had a reputation, not just of leading from behind, but at the critical moment of battle, he might pick up a shield himself, take his sword, and go to the front line.
Should we believe these stories of Caesar's personal intervention in battle? It's clear that much of the story that he writes is intended to give the impression of his own superhuman capacities.
Caesar says that his intervention is key to victory. But could there be another explanation? Some historians think that the Aedui cavalry didn't join in the battle. Instead, they waited to see which side would win. Without Aedui tribe reinforcements, Vercingetorix must know that all is doomed. He orders the Gauls to retreat to Alesia.
It should have been a place where he could have defended himself and held out against Rome, but Caesar instead turned it into a death trap.
Legend has it that Vercingetorix could have escaped, but refuses to leave his troops. He assembles his last council of war. After 6 months of fighting, the forces are scattered and the soldiers exhausted. Vercingetorix decides he will surrender to Caesar. Today, Vercingetorix's surrender is remembered as the action of a hero. But now historians are uncovering the truth about how our understanding of the Gauls and their war leader has been shaped. They think it began at this French castle in the 19th century, when Emperor Napoleon III ordered the creation of the National Museum of Archaeology.
Napoleon III was the first elected president, but he became emperor, and so he has a need, a concern for legitimacy. And what he wants to show is that when new emperors arise, like the Roman emperor, for example, or like Napoleon III himself, humanity takes a leap forward in progress. So what he wants to show with this museum is that the Roman conquest civilized us, took us from Gauls to Gallo-Romans, gave us cities, gave us culture, and the idea is that Napoleon III himself is going to do the same thing with France.
In the early 1860s, Napoleon III organized excavations of all the major battle sites of the Gallic War. He ordered for large public exhibitions showing scale models of the Roman siege works in an attempt to show the skill of the invading force.
The engineers of Napoleon III started to reconstruct the things that were described in Caesar's text or whose remains were found during excavations, like this bridge that Caesar had built over the Rhine to invade Germany.
This was the first time that the French became aware of the forgotten history of their Gaul ancestors. Napoleon III's aim was to show the impact that Caesar had on the country. But the public are much more fascinated by Vercingetorix and his Gaul freedom fighters.
In a very ironic way, while he wanted to make a museum that would be about the glory of Julius Caesar, he brought the unknown Gallic civilization out of the shadows. And he showed the greatness, the sophistication of this Gallic society rather than its primitive side.
It's this museum that built the legend of Vercingetorix. 19th century painters reimagine his surrender, portraying him as dominating Caesar, even in defeat. But historians today doubt this version of events. They believe that it wasn't a free man who surrenders, but a chained prisoner whose fate now lies with Caesar. But his prisoner is far too precious to be executed. Caesar has other plans for Vercingetorix. With the rebellion's main force defeated, he spends the next months eliminating the last pockets of resistance. After 8 years of war, Caesar's gamble has paid off.
The Gallic War changed Caesar's life fundamentally. It gave him the reputation as one of the great generals of Rome, one of the greatest generals of all time.
During his conquest, Caesar had also amassed a fortune by stealing from and plundering from the Gauls.
He returns to Rome and seizes power in a civil war. Establishing himself as dictator for life, Caesar organizes a parade known as a triumph, with his face painted red in honor of the god Jupiter.
For Vercingetorix, Caesar had devised a worse punishment than simply to be killed on the spot. Instead, he was made to suffer the suspense of 6 years wallowing in captivity, which were followed with the ultimate public humiliation.
The Roman ruler will parade his vanquished enemy during his triumph, a man that the ordinary citizens of Rome knew of thanks to Caesar's writing.
The ultimate fate of Vercingetorix was to be strangled behind closed doors once the triumph had come to its end.
Julius Caesar's brutal conquest of Gaul made him the richest and most powerful person in Rome. But his success will be short-lived. 2 years after the death of Vercingetorix, Caesar is murdered in the Roman Senate by 60 conspirators. And it all started with Gaul.
Without the events that transpired in Gaul, Caesar never would have been able to rise up to the level of dictatorship, his eventual dictatorship for life, and his very dramatic assassination, which set into motion events that brought about an utter change in the Roman political system from a republic to an empire governed by one individual alone.
And Gaul was transformed in the process.
The statistics that the Romans themselves gave about the Gallic War are truly terrifying. There were 800 cities taken, 1 million were killed, another million enslaved. So the Gallic War was very devastating to Celtic societies. Cultures were wiped out, religious sanctuaries destroyed, wealth seized. But the long-term impact was not totally destruction, but also transformation.
In many respects, the history of Gaul as it exists in Western literature commences with Caesar. That's a significant cultural choice. with very important implications for the self-understandings of the Gauls who came after. And materially, life in Gaul was reorganized, largely from the bottom up around Roman norms.
It's only now that the truth about the lost world of the Gauls can finally be exposed.